Hi guys, and welcome to this video where we're going to be covering the New York style parallel compression technique, and we're going to use this to get louder and more powerful mixes without squashing the life out of the dynamics and the transients of our track, and also without adding a great amount of gain either. So before we dive straight in, I'm just going to demonstrate to you what parallel compression sounds like. So I've got this little house loop that I've made, and the first time round it's going to be with parallel compression and the second time it will be without. So just have a listen. So as you can probably hear there, we're getting a lot of extra body, power and weight in this drum track, so it's quite a useful technique to understand. So what is the difference between standard downward compression, parallel compression and New York compression? Well, essentially it's all the exact same thing, it's all still downward compression, and what I mean by that is we are compressing the peaks or the transients down and reducing the dynamic range. All of the different types do the exact same thing. However, with parallel compression, we're doing this in a parallel configuration. So that's either by having it at 50% dry wet, or by using a send and return, or by duplicating the track and doing it on a completely separate parallel track. So what this basically means is that we can use much more aggressive compression settings on our parallel chain whilst leaving our original track completely uncompressed. And then what we do with our parallel chain is then we mix that in underneath the uncompressed version, and that's going to supply us with the extra weight and the loudness that we want. And then the uncompressed chain is still going to have all of that transient and dynamic information, so we get the best of both worlds. Whereas if we were to just do this by standard compression, then we're going to be able to hear that we've compressed it, and we're going to squash the life out of the signal, and we're going to lose a lot of that dynamic information, which is really important in dance music. So now that you know what parallel compression is, the only difference between that and New York style compression is that New York style compression also has an EQ device after the compressor. And this is basically used to highlight certain areas of the frequency spectrum and make it sound louder than it actually is. And the typical way of doing this is to use the Fletcher-Munson equal loudness curve. So we boost at around 100 Hz and 10 kilohertz roughly, just by a few dBs, and what this does is it psychoacoustically makes us think that the track sounds louder and clearer. This extra little EQ trick originated from New York City, and so hence the name got coined New York style compression. So some of the uses of New York style parallel compression is, as we've already mentioned, we can get more power, thickness and weight by using it. We can also make a track sound more psychoacoustically louder without adding a great amount of peak level as well. We can raise the quieter details in a track, because obviously as we parallel compress and we blend that in, we're going to be adding extra decay, and we're going to be bringing up things like the reverb sends, and all these quieter parts that we're heavily compressing are going to be brought up depending on our threshold value. And the knock-on effect of this, which is also quite a useful thing for parallel compression, is that it's going to glue all of our drums together, because we're bringing up all of these quieter details that are going to act as mixed glue. And then finally, another use of parallel compression is on vocals. And what we can do is we can use this to give our vocals more attitude and also allow the performance to sound more consistent, because we've raised that average RMS level. When it comes to the settings for parallel or New York style compression, we tend to go quite aggressive with it, because we are doing this on a parallel track, and we're not actually going to hear this parallel track on its own. It's going to be blended in, so therefore we can get away with using some pretty over-compressed settings, and it's still going to sound good in the context of the mix. There's a few different compressors that are quite good for this, but one that's commonly used is a FET compressor called the 1176, because not only is it nice and fast and responsive, but it also has quite a nice saturation style quality to it as well. In this case, I'm just going to use the standard Ableton compressor though. When we're setting the attack time, we want the attack to be nice and fast, and this is going to slam the entire of the signal and compress all of it without letting any of the transients through. If we had it letting a bit more of the transient through, this would actually add punch, but the downside of this is that it might actually add extra peak level to our track, because we're going to be letting too much of the transient through, which is going to sum with the original track as well. The release time's usually set quite fast, but we can back this off a little bit if it is sounding a little bit too aggressive, and this will just smooth it out and give a more natural sound. One thing that's always the same with parallel compression is we want to be using quite a high ratio, usually about 8 to 1 and above, but most people will use 10 to 1 and above, which is essentially a brick wall limiter. Be careful when you're setting your compressor threshold, because if you set this too low, you're actually going to really elongate the decay of the drums and you could mess with the groove. And as well as that, you're also going to bring up the noise floor, any sort of atmospherics or reverb tails as well. So there is a healthy balance for where you want to set this to make sure you get the maximum weight but without bringing out too much of the background noise that you don't want. So a good sort of benchmark to aim for is between 10 and 20 decibels of gain reduction. Me personally, I like to use about 10 decibels. I think that's a nice happy medium for getting a powerful sound without having too much background noise brought up into the mix. The final couple of things you need to think about is how much of this signal do you want to blend in. So a good way of doing this is to look at your master channel if you've got the original track and your new parallel compressed track soloed, and just make sure that you're not adding too much peak level with the master channel. And if you are, either drop it down a little bit on your parallel track or maybe tighten up the attack time on your compressor to stop so much of the peak getting through. What you can then do afterwards is you can mute and bypass and just see how it sounds and make any adjustments that you might need to. And then finally, we're just going to add the New York part into the equation, which is to drop on a EQ device. And all we're going to do here is find the sort of areas we want to boost, and then we can either use the shelving or a peak filter to boost in those areas by the amount we want. And we can also pull out a tiny part around the 300 Hertz, which is a little bit of the low mid sort of mud area, so that can help to give a bit of clarity whilst also enhancing the lows and the highs. I'm now just going to bypass this a few times and alter the scale so you can hear the actual effect of the EQ8 and the actual compression itself. So just to recap on how to set up New York style compression, first we need to duplicate the track that we want to compress, then we place a compressor on this new track and we adjust the settings so we've got some aggressive compression with plenty of gain reduction, and then we can set the attack, release, ratio and threshold so we either slam the compressor or we give it a little bit of extra punch depending on what we want. What we then do is blend this parallel chain back in with the original signal, keeping an eye on our overall levels. And then finally we can add an EQ8 and then we can boost or cut where appropriate. But usually this will be a sort of loudness, smiley face type curve. So in this video I've covered New York style parallel compression and how we can use it to get the best of both worlds from a dynamic and transient rich track, as well as a nice powerful and weighty track which has been heavily compressed. For more mix techniques, don't forget to subscribe and check out our website.